The moment she laughed, the room turned into something I barely recognized. We were standing in a small church that smelled like lilies and old wood, the kind of place where people move slower than they talk. Hands folded, heads bowed, the soft hum of prayers around us. My mother lay in front of us. The world paused, and my sister, my own sister, whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. "Who let her out of that thrift shop?" she said, with that thin, practiced smile she always used when she wanted people to notice her cleverness. It wasn't the words themselves that broke me. It was the way she made it a show. The way she leaned into it as if the funeral was a stage and she had rehearsed the line a dozen times. Heads turned, eyes flicked my way. I felt the hum of their judgment like a static charge on my skin. I had chosen a simple dress that day. Not because I couldn't buy anything fancier. Years of late nights and risk had built something I was quietly proud of, but because it felt right. Mom had always hated fuss at ceremonies. "Keep it modest and honest," she used to say. So I followed her last wish. The label sewn inside the seam read my name and the company I'd started 5 years earlier. I kept things humble. No logos, no flashing signs. I liked the work because it let the clothes speak, not the name. My brand wasn't famous yet. It was something I built from thrift store inspiration, from late-night sketches, from the hiss of a sewing machine in the corner of a tiny studio apartment. It was my small rebellion, my love letter to Mom's quiet taste. But when the whisper hit, thrift shop, that tiny room filled with 1,000 imagined judgments. Some of them were probably true. I had made choices that looked odd to others. I didn't have the right face for magazines. I had the wrong haircut for the season. And my sister had the right outfit for every room she walked into. She didn't stop. "Honestly, who dresses like that?" she said. It was a sneer wrapped in sympathy, the worst kind of cruelty. Under her breath, she added, "Of course she can't afford better." Laughter leaked from a couple of people who always liked her jokes. I remember gripping the edge of the pew until my fingers went numb. My heart was pounding like a small animal. I wanted to say something, anything, but the funeral rules were plain and merciless. Calm, composed, no theatrics. All the anger folded suddenly inward and turned cold. After the service, people drifted toward the reception hall, murmurs softening into condolences and polite questions. Someone patted my back. Someone else asked if I needed help. My sister swept past me with a cluster of friends and relatives, her laugh floating back. She made a show of consoling people, and when she passed me again, she touched my sleeve like an afterthought and said, not quietly enough, "Try not to embarrass the family." I wanted to take her by the wrists and twist her head toward the label of my dress and say, "You know what this is? Mine." I wanted to rip off a mask she'd worn her whole life, the mask that made kindness conditional on the story she told that day. But I didn't. I nodded. I smiled. I held the weight of silence like a stone in my mouth. That night, after the flowers were sent and the last of the guests left the house, I sat on the edge of my mother's bed. Her lipstick, a small vintage compact, the notebooks I had grown up doodling in, all the ordinary things that made her human, looked like relics of a life that did not feel whole without her. My sister texted me a single emoji and a kiss. My reply was 3 dots, and then nothing. I lay there and watched the ceiling until the words that had been stored up all week, funny things Mom had said, the supper table jokes, the way she used to say my name, melted into a single, quiet ache. I had started the brand because Mom had always believed in giving people a second chance. Secondhand fabric, second looks, second chances at feeling beautiful.
I built every design around that idea. I named the first collection after her, in secret, because it was easier to do anything in secret when you were still afraid people would laugh. I didn't know at that moment how much that one small laugh at that one small dress would change everything.
You have to understand where I started to understand how fragile people's judgments can be. After Mom left, the little studio felt even smaller. Her death had pulled most of the light out of the apartment and left me with a stubborn quiet that made thinking harder, but doing easier. Work became a refuge and a promise. If I could breathe life into fabric, I could stitch a shape of a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. The brand, my brand, began with scraps. I collected damaged bolts of fabric from a downtown salvage shop and sent them to my sewing machine like they were letters from another life. I taught myself draping with late-night YouTube clips, but mostly with trial and error. A dress was just a conversation between hands and cloth. Sometimes the cloth was stubborn, sometimes the hands were. The first piece that people noticed was a coat I made from a patchwork of vintage linens. I entered it into a small local showcase that my friend from art school was organizing. I didn't expect anything. I brought the coat in a plain bag, tied a note to it, for whoever needs it, and handed it to the organizer like it was a secret offering. The coat sold in 5 minutes. The woman who bought it cried when she tried it on, real surprised tears, and left a review that made someone else call me and ask if I could make 10 more. That first call turned into 2 more, then into a small shop asking to stock a few pieces. I taught myself how to invoice, how to package, how to write polite emails that didn't sound like apologies. I did it all with a stubborn kind of love because, in the beginning, every sale was proof. Proof that I could make something out of nothing. Proof that my hands could do more than fold grief into neat squares. Business grew the way it does when you're not trying to be noticed, quietly, by word of mouth. Small magazines wrote short paragraphs about sustainable design. Influencers with soft aesthetics shared photos that were flattering enough to bring curiosity. I hired one part-time helper, then another. We became a cobbled family of late nights and shared coffee. None of that made me famous. None of that made me immune to the kind of people who like to measure others by their appearance. But it made me resilient in a way that felt like armor. When I chose the dress for the funeral, I didn't think about making a statement. It was one of our simplest designs. Clean line, modest hem, soft collar. It had been through a dozen edits and fit like something a mother would approve of. I had made 3 of them. I gave one to a friend who was pregnant. I kept one for myself. I imagine for my sister, growth looked different. She moved through the world with a different energy, one that made people comfortable with her confidence. She married into a family known for sharp eyes and sharper tongues. Where I saved for fabric, she saved for the right handbag and the right shoes. Where I found comfort in small rooms, she built comfort in fluttering rooms filled with gossip and champagne. When people praised her, she smiled as if their praise had always been due. When she criticized me at the funeral, people learned something about the family they didn't already know. There was a class inside our house that measured worth in things, not in work. That realization burned. It wasn't just me she mocked. It was everything Mom taught me by example. Value and second chances, love and quiet labor. The laughter at the church felt like a hand turning the lock on a door I had kept bolted. So I did the only thing I knew that might change what the world saw. I returned to making. I returned to the studio with the same stubbornness that had kept me going before. Only now, every stitch felt like a note in a secret song I intended to sing loudly. I started to plan, but not in the way you might expect. I didn't want to humiliate her in public and make a spectacle. I wanted to show her what she had missed. I wanted to reveal the truth gently, like the way you remove a scarf to show someone's face and watch the air change. I made a decision that night. I would not lower myself to pettiness. I would not attack her looks. Instead, I would let the clothes do the talking. I didn't write a spreadsheet. I didn't create a PowerPoint. My plan existed as a series of small, careful choices, like a stitch that starts in the dark and eventually shows on the right side of the fabric. First, I expanded production quietly. Not for the world, yet, but to show up consistently. We needed more hands to finish orders, so I hired 2 more local seamstresses. Both were women with their own stories of small victories and deep debts. They were proud. They were tired. We worked in shifts, our machines making a soft river of sound that kept the studio warm. Second, I focused on a capsule collection I called Heirloom. It was built on the idea that clothing should last and stories should travel with fabric. I designed pieces with hidden pockets for letters, linings made from old scarves, and one borrowed pattern from my mother's favorite dress. The collection was literally threaded with memory. To promote it, I held an intimate showing at the studio. I invited a few friends, a couple of local stylists, and a woman who wrote for a magazine that liked slow fashion. The showing wasn't flashy. There were candles, tea, and the kind of hush that makes people feel like they're part of something private. I wanted it to feel honest. Word spread differently this time. The magazine wrote a small piece that didn't feel like praise or flattery, just recognition. A stylist posted a photo. A small boutique offered to host a pop-up. Orders trickled in. And then something unexpected happened. A wedding planner texted me to ask whether we could make a few bridal pieces. The planner said, "Your aesthetic is different. It feels like memory." They wanted custom work for a client who liked understated designs. Slowly, the brand crept out of the corners where my sister's voice could reach it. People began to associate my name with work that felt like care. My sister, meanwhile, continued on her steady slope of public approval. She posted photos of her life, the right angles, the right brunches. She would occasionally mention me in family posts with a casual sting, a memory made sharper by selective memory. People would comment with hearts and jokes. I saw those posts sometimes and felt the old ache. Sometimes the ache softened, sometimes it flared. The real conflict began when the boutique that had offered the pop-up asked if they could feature a portrait of the maker, the person behind the label. We decided to record a short interview, nothing polished, where I told the story of the coat that sold in 5 minutes and why I liked using old fabric. The interviewer asked about sustainability and about mothers. I talked about Mom. I spoke about taking second chances. The video was posted and overnight something shifted. The video was shared. A woman who used to work with fashion influencers posted a story of one of our dresses and called it a quiet revolution. My sister saw it. Her name did not appear anywhere, but our shared family history drew her like a moth to the light. A week later, at a family gathering I didn't expect to attend, my sister pulled me aside. She had that slight tilt in her head, the one she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. She said, "I saw your video. Who knew?" There was a half apology in her voice, as though she had to compute a new fact about me. Maybe I should have been satisfied with the small victory. Instead, I felt the old wound opening. "Who knew?" had always been the world's worst verdict. It meant that people had refused to look at me until someone else handed them evidence. I kept my face neutral and said, "Mom knew." Her eyes softened for a second. Of course she did. She meant it in a way that left me unsure. Did she mean Mom knew my worth, or did she mean Mom knew all of our family's unspoken secrets? That night, alone in the studio, I let myself imagine a small world where she acknowledged the hurt she had caused. Then I closed my eyes and looked at the workbench where a dozen dresses hung like a promise. There are ways to make someone see you without shouting. There are ways to bring people to the edge of their arrogance and let them fall, not with shame, but with the humility that comes from discovery. I didn't want her to pay for what she had done. I wanted her to understand. Understanding, I thought, would be a better kind of victory. The boutique announced a small event.
a designer evening where a handful of local creators would show their work. It was meant to be quiet, tasteful, the kind of event where people sipped wine and discussed craftsmanship instead of Instagram numbers. My team and I prepared with a kind of focus that quieted everything else. I chose pieces that felt like the opposite of spectacle. We ironed, we folded, we attached tiny cards that told the story behind each garment. One card talked about a pocket made to hold a small letter. Another explained that a hem was cut from the fabric of a dress my mother had worn to her own wedding decades before. The night arrived, and the boutique filled with an almost shy excitement. People drifted in, fingers rubbing the fabrics, smiles like small sunlight. The owner introduced us, and I talked for a few minutes about why I made things the way I did. It was honest, and my voice didn't shake. Then my sister arrived. She didn't come alone. She walked in with a crowd of people who lit up when they saw her the way a room brightens when someone opens a window. The air shifted. I watched her from across the store, feeling a hush slide under my ribs. She wore something glamorous, impeccable, the kind of outfit that says, "You've never had to prove anything." She greeted people with practiced warmth. She didn't look at the dresses. She looked at the crowd, at who was watching her. She found me, gliding across the showroom floor. Her smile was the same one that had cost me a funeral's worth of dignity. "Wow," she said, touching a sleeve with a casualness that felt like possession. "This is nice. I never realized you had this in you." The words were small, but there was poison inside the sugar. She had the kind of love that makes you feel like a project you're supposed to admire from the outside. "You didn't have to come," I said. My voice was quieter than I'd intended. Part of me wanted to run, to hide in the back room with bolts of fabric and close the door on the world. She tilted her head. "Oh, come on. I'm here now. You're doing well, right? It's cute." A woman standing nearby heard that and laughed lightly. I saw the way her gaze flicked between us, the way she registered who looked like a success and who looked like cute. That laugh was a small arrow that landed somewhere in the middle of my chest. I kept my composure. I handed a card to a woman asking about a dress. I smiled when someone complimented the workmanship, but every time my sister's voice came close, it was a little knife. Later, when the crowd thinned, she cornered me in the back where boxes were stacked and fabric scraps lived like leftovers. There was a softness in her voice then. It seemed deliberate, like a change of costume. She said, "I wanted to say I'm sorry for earlier, at the funeral. It was thoughtless." Surprise hit me harder than I wanted to admit. People rarely said sorry unless they wanted forgiveness as a flaunt. Still, a part of me wanted to believe. I wanted to swallow everything and feel lighter. She continued quickly. "Also, I was thinking, maybe you should do a collaboration with my friend. She runs a boutique and hosts, bigger shows. It might be good for you." It sounded generous on the surface and strangled underneath. I felt the old instincts rise. Accept the olive branch, but remain wary. There was a history. Our mother taught us to be kind, but she also taught us to be careful about the hands that reached for you. I said, "Thank you. I appreciate that." She smiled, satisfied. "Good, because I think a brand like yours
Quirky, vintage-inspired, could use a nudge. Later that night, I lay awake turning the moment inside like a stone. Was she sincere? Was this an attempt to soften her image after the funeral? Was it, at worst, another performance where she chose to control how the story ended? I decided to let it play out. If this collaboration could give my brand a platform, I would take it. But I would not let her dictate the narrative. I would not become a prop. We arranged a meeting. It was businesslike at first. Emails, dates, an exchange of ideas. She introduced me to a publicist who liked my aesthetic, to a stylist who liked to pair realness with glamour. The plan was to present a small runway show in a hotel event room, tasteful, of course, a place where people wore faces that smelled like perfume. It would be a fast track to a wider audience. I felt the trap of opportunity and walked into it with eyes open, but I also held a secret intention. This would be the moment where I let the truth and the work meet in a way that couldn't be refuted. I would not attack her face. I would not call out her words from the funeral. I would instead reveal myself in a way that left room for her to see herself in the reflection. The stakes were now higher. I had to decide how much of myself to risk on public soil.
Preparation for the show felt like preparing for a kind of personal exam. My team worked for weeks. We designed looks that bridged my grandmother's thrift stop sensibility with something that felt graceful for a more formal runway. We kept the names of the pieces intimate: postcard dress, quiet coat, tea table blouse. Each had a small tag explaining the story behind it, but we decided to keep those tags tucked into pockets for the hotel show. People at that event wouldn't pick up cards. They would watch. I had a quiet plan in the plan, a simple, honest reveal after the show. Nothing dramatic, no shouting or public humiliation. My intention was to put a short film into the program. It would show the process, the salvage fabric, the seamstress's hands, my mother's dress pattern, and the little things that made a collection real. I wanted viewers to see not the label, but the people. If my sister wanted to stand at the edge of the room and mock, she would at least have to watch what had fed the life she was snide about. We rented a small projector. We edited the film ourselves. It was personal, no slick agency polish, so it came across raw. I recorded narration in my own voice, careful not to sound like I was begging. I wanted it to sound like testimony. On the day of the show, the hotel room looked like any other fashion event. Polished men with clipboards, girls with heels that sounded like metronomes, and a bartender with a legal charm. My sister arrived in a shimmer that made people turn. She settled herself into a seat as if the room belonged to her. The show went smoothly. The models wore our pieces like they had always belonged to them. The crowd watched politely. Applause fluttered like clocks. At the end, instead of doing a long speech, I said 3 sentences. This collection is called Heirloom. It's made from things people left behind. It belongs to the women who sewed it. Then I gestured toward the screen. The film started. The projector hummed. People blinked. The film showed faces that had weathered things differently than our room. It showed my mother leaning over an old sewing machine, a seamstress laughing as she pinned a hem, my own hands smoothing a collar. There were close-ups of stitches that were slightly crooked, but brave. The simple care of it held the room in the way a prayer can hold a church. When the film ended, there was a silence that tasted like breath held too long. Then applause, soft at first, then stronger. People came forward to ask questions about the pieces. A stylist reserved 5 garments. A boutique owner wrote a check on the spot. From the back row, I felt my sister's presence like a shadow. She turned to look at me with a face that didn't know how to hold tenderness. Her smile was smaller now, as if the fabric of the film had somehow altered her right to laugh. After the show, the publicist we had worked with came to me and said, "That was honest. People respect that." She meant it. And it was a truth that I let sit in me like a warm piece of bread. I didn't want to gloat. I didn't want to use success as a club. But seeing her watch the film without her usual commentary felt like a gentle victory. It wasn't revenge and the sense of retribution. It was a reclamation of dignity. That night, as we loaded the van with boxes for the first boutique order, my sister called. Her tone was low. "Can we talk?" she asked. I hesitated, then agreed. We met for coffee at a place that had soft lighting and cheap pastries. She looked tired in a way the camera couldn't capture. Perhaps the film had stripped some of the armor she wore like a coat. "I'm proud of you," she said, without preamble. The words clattered out like an awkward apology, as though she had rehearsed them and still been startled to feel them on her tongue. "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot." She stared at her hands for a long time and then met my eyes. "I was cruel," she said, "at the funeral. I shouldn't have said those things." It was small, but it felt honest. "Why?" I asked softly. She shrugged a shrug that carried the weight of habit. "Maybe because I didn't know how to grieve. Maybe because I always positioned myself as the sister who knew how to manage things." Her voice softened. "I thought if I controlled the story enough, it would stop hurting me." I listened. For the first time, I realized she had been performing not just for others, but for herself. Her cruelty was a mask of control. I wanted to accept her apology. Part of me wanted to run my hands over the table and erase months of silence. But I also knew forgiveness needed to be more than a sentence exchanged over coffee. It needed to have a foundation. So I suggested something that surprised even me. I said, "Come to the studio. Spend a day. See." She looked up, puzzled. "Why?" "Because it might mean something different when you see where the work goes. Come see the women who sew. Come meet the people who put these pieces together." She agreed reluctantly.
The studio smelled like warm cotton and steel. The machines made a steady rhythm that people who worked there could probably hear in their sleep. When my sister walked in, she blinked against the light. She had always been comfortable in polished places. The studio was different. A little noisy, a little messy, full of laughter that didn't sound like it belonged to any influencer. There was a pot of strong coffee and a table strewn with patterns. Bolts of fabric leaned like trees against the wall. I introduced her to the team. They greeted her with cautious smiles. I watched her face as she met the women who made the clothes she had mocked. I wanted to place a camera in the middle of the room and still capture nothing as touching as her silence. We started with a cup of tea. I told her about the first coat and the woman who had cried. I showed her the notebook where I kept scraps of ideas. The kind of book that looks messy until you realize every messy line was a future. Then I pulled out the piece that was my mother's wedding hem. I told the story of how I found the fabric in a box at the thrift store and recognized the tiny tear at the seam. My sister held the fabric like you hold a small animal. Her breath hitched. We walked through the process, patterning, cutting, basting, sewing. She watched a seamstress, an older woman named Layla, who worked with a precision that made the cloth behave. Layla told the story about how she had sewn even as a child, how the work had kept her through winters and raised her daughter. My sister's eyes filled. Not the polite, social eye fill you often see on thumbnails. This was quiet, private. At one point, a pocket came out slightly uneven. Layla laughed and adjusted it, muttering about keeping hands steady. My sister watched, and then she did something I didn't expect. She asked if she could try the sewing machine. I handed her the seat like it was a small invitation into our world. Her hands were clumsy at first,
The thread skipped. She frowned. But then she straightened and tried again. The machine clicked. She made a small, uneven line of stitches and started to laugh. Real laughter, surprised and a little embarrassed. "It's harder than it looks," she said. "Everything worth doing is," Layla answered, and the room hummed around the truth. We went through the workshop like that, small revelations. At the end, she helped tie labels into garments and was privy to the slow kindness of our labor. She met the woman who would be delivering a dress to a widow the next day and listened to the story of how the woman's daughter had picked the fabric for its softness. As the day ended and the light dropped, she turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen before, a softness that was not performative. "I didn't know," she said simply. It was both confession and question. "You didn't have to know," I said, thinking about the funeral like a bruise. "But you can know now." She looked at me, vulnerability gently exposed. "I said cruel things," she whispered. "I want to do better. I don't know how." There was a moment where the old part of me, the part that had been bruised and smarting, wanted to shout, to demand a list of apologies in public and a retraction in headlines. But my mother's voice echoed in my mind, the way she used to tell us to choose humility over loudness. So I took a breath. You can start by listening, by being present, by not measuring people's worth in a glance. We stood there in the falling light, surrounded by piles of fabric and the hum of the machines. Forgiveness began as a small thing that night, more like a decision than a feeling. It was a work in progress in the way our garments were, stitched piece by piece, often imperfect, but stitched with care. That evening, as she left, she hugged me. It was awkward and real. "I want to help, not as a patron, if you'll let me, but as someone who wants to learn." I felt both hope and fear. People change in degrees, not in headlines. But there was something in her posture that night that made me believe it could be different. The real test would come soon. 7. The storm and the choice. Climax. Change, I learned, is not a single act. It's a series of small choices strung together like beads, and sometimes a single storm can test whether those beads hold. A few weeks after my sister's visit, a local influencer with a large following posted pictures from the hotel show. The photos were flattering, but her comment, thin and cruel, spun our story into a rumor. She suggested that the heirloom collection was a sentimental hobby and not real fashion. The phrase spread like a stain. Comments poured in. People who had liked the film suddenly sounded unsure. Questions like, "Is that professional?" echoed in threads where there had been kindness before. My team and I watched the numbers climb, the kind of visibility that can be both blessing and trial. We had orders and press, but we had detractors now too. It felt like standing in a busy street and hearing only the people who wanted to shout. At home, I read the comments until my chest felt heavy. My sister texted immediately. "I saw what's happening. What do you want me to do?" she asked. I could have told her to keep quiet. I could have told her to retreat. But I had, less than a month before, shown her the machines, the women, the hands. I asked instead, "Can you come to the studio tomorrow morning? There's a delivery from the boutique you work with." She came. She walked into the room like someone who had chosen to show up in full daylight. A storm of criticism sometimes needs a human shield that is willing to stand between the stones and the ones being struck. We decided to do something simple and true. We invited the influencer and a few other local press members to the studio for a behind-the-scenes day. No fanfare, no press release, just coffee, a tour, and an invitation to stay. My sister insisted on making the calls. Clumsy at first, then confident. She took a list and started calling people from her contacts. She didn't ask for praise. She asked people to see. The day arrived. The influencer came with her photographer and 2 assistants. There was an awkward silence when they first stepped into the studio, as though they had walked into something that didn't have a script. I showed them the process: measuring, tacking, fitting. The influencer tried on a jacket, then came out and, for the first time in a while, asked to sit with a seamstress and listen to her story. Time does strange things. The skeptic can become curious if shown how much heart has gone into the thing they disparage. The influencer's tone shifted slowly through the day, from glossy and distant to quietly attentive. She posted a story of the seamstress who stitched pockets that could hold letters. Her caption read, "There's more here than I thought." Comments changed. The rumor that had spread like a weed began to wither. People who had doubted now asked where to buy a dress and who the seamstresses were. It was small and real and enough. But the real storm came in the form of a family dinner, the kind that had heavy food and heavier conversation. My sister had invited me and our family to celebrate the boutique's success. She had planned the evening and chosen the music. She even bought a pie, which was the kind of compromise both of us appreciated. We sat around the table, and for a moment it felt like the old days, awkward but tender. Then my mother's name came up, because you can't talk about a family without reaching around the absence she left. My sister began to tell a story about Mom, funny, warm, a little self-deprecating. The room leaned in. Then, in a voice softer than the others, she said quietly, "I was mean at the funeral. I made a joke, and I didn't mean to make it public. I didn't realize what I was saying. I'm sorry." The room inhaled. My father, who had rarely spoken about his feelings, nodded. My aunt's eyes went wet. I felt the old sharpness lift in my chest. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Not because I needed her apology as currency, but because forgiveness finally had a place to live. I looked at her and saw a woman who was trying to step out of old patterns. I saw the smallness of human selves, how easy it is to snap into familiar roles, and how hard it is to change. I forgave her aloud. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was ordinary, like the placing of a hand on another's shoulder. There were tears and some laughter, and the pie was passed around like an offering. The storm had been weathered not by grand gestures, but by showing up and choosing tenderness over revenge.
When the dust settled, things were quieter in a way that felt right. We continued making. Orders came and went. The boutique where we had our pop-up restocked. The film was featured in a small documentary about slow fashion. People came to the studio to volunteer, to learn, to donate fabric. We started a small program to teach sewing to young women in the neighborhood, something Mom would have loved. The work multiplied outward, not into fame, but into connections that mattered. My sister became a regular at the studio. At first, she came awkwardly, hands unsure, then with a kind of growing confidence that wasn't about appearance, but about competence. She learned to sew straight lines and to compassionately ask about the life of a pattern. She began to speak warmly of our mother in public, not to perform, but because she felt it in her bones. She also began to pick up the phone to call people who were lonely. She would visit the seamstresses' older mothers and bring pies. She used the contacts she had built for years to help our small brand find opportunities that didn't require her to make a show of generosity. It was subtle. She didn't shout her actions from rooftops. She simply did them. There were days when old habits surfaced, a sharp tone here, a curt comment there. But when that happened, she apologized without drama. She had learned to name her wrongdoing, and that made forgiveness easier to hold. As for me, I learned that healing doesn't erase the past. It gives the past a new place to live. I didn't forget that she had laughed at the funeral. I remembered it like a scar remembers a fall, an odd mark that makes you more careful. But the scar didn't dictate my entire life. It became one part of a larger story. There were financial changes, too. The brand reached stability, not the dizzying heights of mainstream fame, but enough to pay the seamstresses a fair wage and to rent a slightly larger studio. We started designing a small line for a local school fundraiser and donated a portion of proceeds to a charity that taught trades to women. In small ways, the business became a vehicle for the values Mom had given us. People started to bring their own secondhand fabric to the studio and share stories about their mothers. We built a collection of pieces that felt like a communal memory. The heirloom line grew into a small movement for people who wanted their clothes to mean something beyond the price tag. One late afternoon, as the sun slanted through the dusty window panes, my sister stood near a rack of dresses and studied a seam. She picked up a card that had been tucked in a pocket long ago, an anonymous note someone had left for the wearer of a dress, and read it aloud. "May this keep you warm when no one else can." She looked at me and smiled without irony. "Mom would have loved this," she said. We both laughed, a real honest sound that felt like glue fixing two pieces of a torn photograph. In that laugh, there was a new kind of intimacy, the kind that comes from shared labor and shared memory. This is not a story about grand revenge or dramatic downfall. That kind of story makes for good headlines, but it rarely reflects how damage is repaired or how people change. Our story, if it's a story at all, is about slow repair, patient truth, and the strange bravery of forgiveness. I learned a handful of things I carry now, like small tools in my pocket. First, people who lash out are often wounded. My sister's mockery at the funeral didn't come from nowhere. It came from a place of fear and habit, and once shown something new, hands doing honest work, she could choose differently. That doesn't excuse cruelty, but it explains it enough to offer space for repair. Second, humility is powerful. I could have screamed my success in everyone's face, or I could have let my work speak. I chose the latter because dignity is a quieter thing, and it travels in a way that shame never can. Third, forgiveness is not a single card you play. It's a practice. It showed up in her showing up, in my opening the studio, in the seamstress's patience, in small apologies given and accepted. Forgiveness never erased grief, but it allowed us to live with it more kindly. Fourth, work has dignity. The film we showed wasn't a stunt. It was an invitation to watch people love something enough to make it better. When people saw the hands behind the work, they understood the value in a new way. That small shift mattered. Finally, legacy isn't about trophies. It's about the practice of care we pass down. My mother taught me to value the quiet things. She taught me to look for the second chance. In the end, I realized that honoring her meant something more than proving anything to the world. It meant building a place where kindness could be learned and returned. I don't pretend everything is perfect. There are still moments where my sister and I don't know the right words. There are days when the old guard of family expectations sneers from the corners. But there are also new rituals, standing together at the studio open nights, picking fabric for a charity dress, laughing at the same private jokes. This is my small revolution, a studio that makes clothes that hold stories, a sister who learned to change, and a life that is stitched together from the rough bits into something that fits. If there's any part of this you take with you when you leave, any small consolation, let it be this: people can surprise you. They can be cruel and then kind. They can wound and then tend. And sometimes the most satisfying victory is not the public collapse of someone who hurt you, but the quiet rebuilding of what your mother taught you to cherish. We all have pieces of fabric in our lives, scraps of memory, torn privileges, and small treasures. What you do with them is up to you. You can throw them away, or you can sew them into something that keeps you warm.
The last thing I want you to picture is simple. A dress hanging by the window of the studio, sunlight finding the threads. In its pocket, folded small, is a note someone once left inside another dress. Wear this when you feel alone. You're never really alone. My sister and I stand across from each other, holding 2 cups of tea. It's raining outside, the kind that makes the city smell like wet pavement and memory. She hands me a small improvised card. On it she has written, clumsily but honestly, sorry. I hand her a scrap of fabric I found in a thrift box, an old piece of my mother's wedding dress hem. We both laugh, because the universe always seems to meet you with a little absurdity, and then we stitch the 2 scraps together with a single thread. The stitch is crooked, imperfect. It doesn't matter. It's ours. We fold the note and tuck it into the pocket of a dress that will travel to a woman who needs it. It's a small act. It's not a headline. It's not meant to be. But for the first time in a long while, I feel my mother's voice in the room, soft, steady, saying, "Keep making things that matter." I do. We do. And that is the end of this story, not of everything, but of the chapter where laughter at a funeral tried to define a life. The laughter is now a memory in a seam, a small part of our history, but not the whole. If you ever find someone mocking the quiet things you love, remember this. Show them the hands. Invite them to see. Sometimes the best way to change a heart is not to shame it, but to let it witness what it had been blind to all along. Thank you for sitting with this story. If you enjoyed it, tell someone about the people who sew quietly. Tell someone about second chances. And maybe, if you have a scrap of fabric and a warm memory, stitch them together and keep them close.